Recording in progress.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hope in the Midst of a Climate Crisis. I'm Suzanne Williver, Associate Director for Outreach and Academic Initiatives at Education Abroad, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us to discuss this really important topic during International Education Week. As we know, the imminent realities of climate change pose challenges for the entire world. Global disruptions will devastate economies, shake the foundations of political institutions, threaten food security, and create an unprecedented refugee crisis. But every disruption creates a space for positive change as well. What are the opportunities we're asking today for hope and growth in a world where the status quo falters? We're so pleased to have with us today faculty experts on climate change from Temple's campuses in Rome, Japan, and here in the US in Philadelphia, who will discuss these challenges and some solutions from multiple perspectives. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's session, Jeff Reintz, Assistant Director for the Center for the Advancement of Teaching. Jeff received his bachelor's degree in English from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and his master's degree and PhD from Illinois State University. At the CAT, he consults with Temple instructors to help create learning environments where the students can flourish, working on any scale from troubleshooting individual problem moments in the classroom to design or redesign of entire courses. He also facilitates workshops on best practices in teaching and learning and has hosted a teaching circle focused on green pedagogy. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and welcome to everybody. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Marissa Cloutier, Sc.D, RD, is Assistant Professor at the College of Public Health at the Philadelphia main campus. Marissa received her doctorate from the Harvard School of Public Health with a major in nutrition science and minors in epidemiology and environmental health. Her dissertation focused on the impacts of food consumption on climate change and global water resources. Marissa has taught in higher education for almost 20 years, having received multiple awards for her teaching. And she's incredibly passionate about helping students to develop into skilled public health professionals. Kimberly Williams Phd is Associate Professor in the Anthropology Department and currently serves as the chair there in the College of Liberal Arts at the Philadelphia main campus. She's a bioarchaeologist who has taught both internationally and nationally within the fields of mortuary and landscape archaeology. She leads ongoing research in Dank, Oman, examining the Bronze Age mortuary practices south of the Hajar Mountains, which has received support from the Fulbright Scholar Program, as well as the Center for Humanities at Temple University, or CHAT, where she serves as the director. Recently, as director of CHAT, Kimberly has led a 2-year cohort of scholars focused on climate change from humanities perspectives. Andrea Innamorati is Professor of Environmental Studies from the College of Liberal Arts at our Rome campus. Andrea is a current Temple Rome professor who holds an MA in Sociology at the Sapienza University. He has recently completed a fellowship program in sustainability science at the John Fitzgerald Kennedy School of Government in the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. He has represented the government of Italy in numerous international conferences and multilateral intergovernmental processes related to sustainable development since 2003, and he has been a key player in the core EU team that negotiated the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production, and focal point of the Task Force on Education for Sustainable Consumption led by Italy between 2006 and 2011. And finally, we have William J Swinton, who goes by Swint. He's an MBA Assistant Dean of International Business at the College of Liberal Arts and Fox School of Business at the Temple University's Japan campus. Swint oversees the International Business and Master and Management programs at TUJ, and is a Temple owl himself, having received his MBA at Temple University. Swint hosts TUJ Sustainability Roundtable, a forum to explore the practical implications of sustainability in business. This roundtable brings together executives, activists, investors, consultants, and academics to promote, critique, and assess sustainability in business in Japan, Asia, and globally. Welcome to all of our panelists. Before we get started with the first question, just a few housekeeping notes. We would ask that all the audience members, please keep yourself on mute for the main portion of our roundtable today. We will have some Q&A later where we would invite you to unmute. In the meanwhile, if you want to, please use the chat tool to submit questions or comments. We'll begin by addressing some of the challenges that have arisen as a result of climate change, and then we'll turn to the future and think about ways that we can find hope and ways forward in the face of climate change. And as I said before, we'll end with some Q&A. We will also ask you at the very end of our program today to share in the chat something that you've learned, an idea that you've had, an action item, something you're going to do as a result of what you learned today, or maybe something you're going to research further on your own. So just to get us started, I'm going to ask each panelist to briefly explain the work they've done in the area of climate change and to identify any specific threats or challenges that they can see from their particular perspective. And I'm going to begin with Marissa, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks for all of you for attending. And so my research, I'm a dietitian, registered dietitian, and my background is all in nutrition. And when I first saw the inconvenient truth, immediately I just stood right up and I just went, what? And so that really, from that moment on, this has been my passion, is to get involved with this area of climate change and how to bring awareness and activism towards trying to understand how we're going to turn this thing around. So I ended up going to get my doctorate specifically on how I can bring my expertise into this conversation, into this realm of climate change. Back then we're talking about mitigation. Now we're talking about adaptation. So again, that's why I went on for my doctoral work, to see how can I contribute to this. And as was mentioned, my doctoral dissertation was having to do with the impact of food consumption on global water resources and climate change. And really, what the biggest challenge and threat that came out of that, and still what I'm learning, is I can't imagine, I can't think of any other sector that's going to be more impacted than the food industry, the food and agriculture. Definitely, environment is everything. Climate and predictability is everything. So that is huge as we go forward. And we've already seen disruptions, and we've seen global markets involving food be unstable, destabilized, if you will. So in particular for those that are living on the margins already. So from my research, again, what pops out is that nothing is simple, especially when it comes to climate change. So this message about we just have to tell everybody to become a vegan, right? Everybody stop eating animal products, stop eating meat, stop doing dairy. Well, if you really, it's not that simple, because people just don't eat one thing, right? They just going to do an easy shift. People eat in patterns. And what the research showed is trying to correlate healthy patterns of eating to climate change and global water resources. We're talking about, we call it the carbon footprint and the water footprint. There is no correlation in terms of healthy eating and climate and water impact. In fact, the water footprint, which is a huge part of this climate change discussion, is water resources, is actually higher in terms of irrigation. And how we do agriculture is we got to completely change the way we do agriculture, especially in terms of irrigation. To drink a soda, high fructose corn syrup, there isn't a large carbon footprint and water footprint on producing high fructose corn syrup or producing soda compared to producing, say, berries, if you will. Unfortunately, I was hoping to go in there. I was going to have this wonderful message to bring into the masses of, just eat well. We can also save the planet. It's not that simple. It's because of the way we do agriculture right now. So So in fact, foods that are linked to weight gain or weight loss, we found in the research that people that actually increased their consumption of yogurt had the greatest amount of weight loss over a 4-year period. Yogurt is part of the dairy industry. The carbon, the water footprint's pretty high. So, it was those that consumed potato chips that had the highest weight gain. Potato chips is not a big carbon and water footprint. So trying to just tackle, so the challenge here is how do we change consumption patterns? We just can't tell people one message, right? It's much more involved. And it was great to see at COP26, and we'll talk about this soon, at COP26, one of the first things coming out of this is President Biden with the United Arab Immigrants have united to bring what's called AIM, which is going to be agriculture initiatives. We'll talk more about that. I know I don't want to take up time here, but so everybody's starting to get it. Agriculture has got to be addressed, and we're going in the right direction with that. So I'll leave it there and to be continued.
Thank you for getting us started, Marissa. Kimberly, would you like to hop in here?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming out. It's after 5 p.m. It's already dark, so it's a strange feeling, and Zoom is challenging for everybody at this time. So as Jeff introduced me, I'm an archaeologist, and my research is actually on mortuary ritual from Bronze Age Arabia. So you might ask how that's related to climate change. One of the things we think about as archaeologists, or some of us think about as archaeologists, are how the climate has changed over the course of history. And in this case, I'm not necessarily referring to man-made climate change. So we're already sort of trained and looking hard at why it is that people change behavior, how that impacts interactions. So where I work in Oman, on the Arabian Peninsula, around 5,000 years ago, you start to see an arid, the climate becomes more arid, and you start to see places farther north, like the Tigris and Euphrates, sort of dry up a little, and people relied on copper resources that they would pursue along these riverways. And so you start to see people head south across the Arabian Gulf to the location where I work to mine copper for these larger power agents. So here, that's where I'm coming from. I'm thinking about that. I'm looking at changes in mortuary ritual that are due to changes in the environment in part, and then how people react. So then fast forward, that's my research. Fast forward a few years, I become director of chat. And I started thinking, what direction can chat go? What I see chat as a vehicle for influencing dialogue in the university, hopefully beyond the university, and supporting public humanities. And where can that have an impact in the world? And coming from this other thinking about natural climate change, of course, I'd been paying close attention to what's happening with man-made climate change and this real crisis that we're having. And so I felt that I should embark on focusing on environmental humanities at chat. So that is how I chose an annual theme of climate for the first year that I was director of chat. We had a very ambitious schedule. We brought in professors of English. I'm going to look at my list here beyond my iPad. Professors of geography, professors of Italian and comparative literature, looking at H.G. Wells. We had a historian looking at Habsburg, Germany, and records of floral and fauna changes. We had an anthropologist come in to talk about how the environment changes ritual in Haiti. We had another English professor coming in talking about cold doings. So we're talking about 18th century writing about climate change. And so I thought this would be a vehicle for making people understand that they've been exposed to this language and this imagery. And in many of the humanities, it provides an opportunity for people to talk about it through a lens they're more comfortable with. So for example, if you're an English literature scholar, perhaps you're more comfortable talking about a particular author in time. And if I can bring in guests that talk about how climate change is reflected in there, or language about environmental change, anxiety about a changing world, that might help make people who don't think they have a place to talk about climate change see their place. Another initiative we're taking at Chat is we have a collaboration with the library, and I'm going to pull this up so I get the title correct too. We're calling this The Stories We Tell Ourselves, the Cultural Analytics of Climate Fiction. So here we are focusing on climate science fiction, post-apocalyptic worlds, and trying to use that as a vehicle for this anxiety that people have been experiencing and that scientists have been arguing about for decades, and that have become part of popular culture, even without us really being aware of it. So for me, I see, as I said, my role is in trying to get that message out and trying to make people who feel that what they do isn't relevant, make them see that it's relevant, and that they can bring that into the classroom. They can bring that into their reading, their close readings of things. They can bring that into their scholarly endeavors without being scientists, which is what I think a lot of people think you need to be in order to approach this question.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. Andrea, could you weigh in, please?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's really a pleasure to talk about these extremely challenging topics, especially to young citizens, to young generations that hopefully will solve this problem, and that we're not really the source of the problem. So it's always a pleasure and a challenge to talk about these pressing topics to you students, because you will unfortunately most probably see, and some of you are already seeing, the effects of climate change on your lives. My main job is a senior policy advisor for the Ministry for the Environment. So I worked since 2005 on many negotiations, both at EU level and within the UN. And so if I have to identify two threats, I'll focus one threat on the international level, which is the need to still scale up our ambitions on climate change as a global community, as a global collective effort to tackle this problem. Because without scaling up these ambitions, it will be very difficult to reach those objectives that the scientific community is telling us we need to achieve to keep that global average temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We'll talk about it probably in a little bit further down the road during this panel discussion, but we're not on track. So scaling up the ambition is the first threat and the first challenge. Why is it a challenge? Because even in Glasgow, we saw that negotiations processes were strongly influenced by vested interests. When we talked about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, that wording was changed. And at the end, it was phasing down fossil fuel subsidies, and that does not mean the same thing in English. Some of the timelines were moved beyond 2050. And again, we'll talk about this further on, but the need to scale up the ambition is at a top priority now. And the clock is ticking. So the further we postpone our decisions for transformational change, the stronger that change will be, and the stronger the impact of that change will be on our daily lives. And the second threat is linked to the first one, because in this transition towards low carbon economy that we hope we will achieve, we need to leave no one behind. Unfortunately, the impacts of climate change are hitting harshly the poorest portions of the populations, and those are the same people that will suffer also from the transition. because of educational levels, because of their position in society. So that is a very big challenge that we need to face in order to not open another problem, which would be on the social level in terms of social conflict. So a takeaway from that would be to include climate change policies and embed them in a more broader framework that I would call sustainable development policies, because in sustainable development considers all three aspects of society: the social aspect, the economic aspect, and the environmental one. And that would buffer a little bit the decisions that we have to take now and in the near future. So again, thank you for having me on the panel. I'm very glad to even to hear questions from the students.
Thank you, Andrea. And phasing down is a new form of doublespeak I hadn't encountered previously. So Swint, would you care to share?
Thank you very much. Thank you for including me on this. I'm speaking to you this morning from Tokyo, where it's just after 7 in the morning. And I'm delighted to see the various parts of the temple whole coming together. As was mentioned, my name is William Swinton. I do the business programs at Temple University Japan campus. And that's the perspective that I come to this issue from. But I'm much newer to these issues than the other panelists. So several years ago, it occurred to me that there were lots of assumptions that were going on in business. And so I come to this issue and this panel as a skeptic, not as a climate skeptic, but as a skeptic of some of the claims that businesses are making and some of the doublespeak that businesses are engaging in, but also as a hopefully as a bridge to the various parties that are involved, because businesses will have to be involved in this process of moving forward, whether we talk about adaptation or amelioration or development. Businesses will have to be involved. And so we are trying to, with the Sustainability Roundtable at TUJ, bring together activists and investors and educators and consultants so that we can begin to tackle some of these problems. We can begin to think of how we will address these challenges. Particularly here in Japan, we are already seeing the impact of climate change. We're in a very vulnerable area vulnerable to nature. And a lot of the Japan culture and business has been about girding itself against problems that can come up from nature for hundreds of years. And so it's a very interesting environment for me to be looking at these issues about how we're going to mediate in this process. So one of the things that we begin to uncover, or two of the things that we look at, is how do we get businesses to go beyond greenwashing, and how do we really hold them accountable? What kind of measurement systems? How can investors really be sure about what they are investing in? So that's one of the things that we find is an important thing, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. But and the other thing that I would point to is how can different levels of society integrate their approaches? And so there has to be governmental action, there has to be business action, there has to be demand action from consumers. How can we bring these various levels and segments of society in coordination? And how can we give individual consumers, individual citizens, some kind of agency without feeling overwhelmed and feel and without seceding all of the impetus to governments and businesses? How can we not let governments off the hook, and how can we not let businesses off the hook? I see myself not as a primary researcher, but as someone who is bringing people from these various perspectives and looking at it first from the lens of Japan, breaking out to Asia, and also having opportunities like this to speak about how this works out on an international basis. So I'm very much, thank you, Jeff, for including me, and I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Swint. So it's difficult for any individual to wrap their head around the full array of disruptions caused by whole-scale alteration of the planet's climate system. So my question for the panelists now is, what is one ongoing or upcoming change that you would want policymakers and ordinary citizens to pay more attention to or even be cognizant of? And we'll start with Andrea.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll be quite straightforward. We need to listen to the science. Policymakers need to strengthen their links with the scientific community. We have it within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have massive amounts of data, massive amounts of reports, but still we're falling short on what the scientific community is telling us to do. So that is my recommendation. It's pretty straightforward. We saw it with COVID. When we were in a desperate situation, at least in our country, the whole government turned to the scientific community for a response to that. Now, climate change is more complicated than COVID. We do not have a vaccine for climate change. And again, the clock is continuously ticking. So I think that's the scientific community has given us a direction. We, in Paris in 2015, when we found the agreement, we listened to scientific community. We included that 1.5 degrees Celsius in the agreement. We know that we have to peak our global GHG emissions as soon as possible, and we have to decarbonize our economy by mid of this century if we want to be within the limits that the scientific community has given us to reduce the risk of extreme consequences. So that is my straightforward response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kimberly?
I would actually, I'll refer to a very thoughtful comment in the chat from Charlene. I think that this gets to the heart of what I would say is the biggest change that I would like to see is more of a focus on environmental ethics, more of an effort to educate people on what small things they can do. Too often you hear that you need big changes from corporations, from companies, from cities, from states, rather than focusing on what individuals can do. And I'd like to see more education on that and a better awareness of individual action, how that can be cumulatively helpful in this crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for your comment, Charlene. Swint.
Thank you. I think, again, from a business perspective, I think that there is a growing sentiment that businesses need to be on the quote unquote right side of history on these issues and these and other issues. And I think that in the rush to do that, they are pretending to make efforts, or they are exaggerating the efforts they're making. And so I think that we need to think about accountability and measurements of the impact of businesses' footprint, carbon footprints.
Did we lose Swint there?
Period, where we will have to. Oh,
you're coming through now, Swint. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. All right. I may have to, I was worried that this might happen. We're in a period as we have figured out how to deal with COVID, that we have enormous amount of problems with our supply chain. And so that is both a problem and an opportunity, that as we go away from just-in-time delivery of products to some other model of supply chain that is friendlier to the environment, I think that that's the issue that I would focus on going forward.
Thank you very much. Marissa?
I just say, I echo Andrea, that the science. We knew this was, I show a film from 1982 to my students, and it was about global warming and what is ahead of us, and everything in that film was completely spot on. It's exactly what we're living today, of what this film. Now we got to think about, now that, you know, we're just over 1 degree Celsius up now, we're talking now 2, 3, 4, what's ahead of us. So we really, all the more reason we got to look at the science. The science has got this. We got to pay attention to that.
All right, thank you. So one of the cognitive difficulties many people might face, myself included, is that the problem of the climate catastrophe seems incomprehensibly large and abstract to address, that it is easy to sort of give in, give up, stop thinking about it. Is there any good news that you can share, any ray of hope you can cast on the situation? Is there an upside or an opportunity available? And we'll begin with Swint on this one.
Yeah, I have a very direct answer for that. No. Let me. However, this is one of the exact things that we look at. So how are we going to respond, and what participation can, as I mentioned before, consumers, for example, individuals, how can they make an impact? And we are seeing some movements in terms of social innovation. So I want to give one example. I want to give one example, and you can judge whether or not you feel it's sufficient. There's a company here called My-Mizu. Mizu is the Japanese word for water, and my water. And what this company is doing, it has an app that connects places in Japan and around the world where you can refill your water bottle. And it also allows consumers to see the collective impact that I'm refilling my water bottle. I'm not buying a pet bottle, or I'm not buying water at the convenience store, but that's only a really, 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 really tiny thing. So I may not be adding to plastic pollution by not buying pet bottles, but again, it's really tiny. But my efforts that I can see through this app, I can see how my efforts bring me into a community. And that community also provides a platform for discussion. So it's very, as you mentioned in the question, it's very overwhelming. And so we found, and some research that some marketing research people that we've had on our panels have showed, is that people want to see how their individual action comes up closer to, joins in with collective action, and then begins to have some kind of impact. So people want to connect their individual action with community action, with corporate action. That's one way that we see people as individuals getting involved.
Thank you very much, Swint. Marissa?
For the students out there, and a shout out to the Generation Z, that is where our hope is. This is a generation like none other. There is a fire in their belly. Yes, that's where our hope is. And for those students out there, it's the best of time. This is the worst of time, you could say, to be graduating. It's also the best of times. It's the Wild West out there. There is so much to be done, and your creativity, your entrepreneurial, spirit, whatever you've got inside of you, you have got an opportunity now to step forward and really make an impact. There is a whole language we have yet to learn as we go forward in this unpredictable future. These phrases that got to be coined, you know, like I just heard the other day, the social science of adaptation. I mean, and so there's so much work out there that it's daunting, yes, but it's also extremely, extremely exciting in terms of you can really, if you could, we need you. And I don't think any other generation where out there that's, you know, where it has been needed so much. And I thank you already out there for Gen Zs for bringing this issue to where we are today. If it wasn't for the youth, I don't think we would have gotten as much progress as we got at COP26, but so that's where the hope is.
Thank you, Marissa. Andrea?
I fully agree with Marissa. I just wrote down my biggest hope is in the push coming from young generations. It's something we haven't seen for the past 50 years, and it's strong, it's global, it touches upon rich and poor countries, and it's heard. Some politicians are also not responding immediately, but there's a push, at least at the European level, because some of these youth generations are young, they don't vote. So they'll vote in 3, 4, 5 years, but they're preparing the ground for some very strong wave of change. The second positive thing, given that Marissa already talked about young generations, was just in response of one of the comments on the chat, comes from the businesses. John Kerry described the Paris Agreement as a success in terms of the vision it projected for the future, especially for businesses. And we're seeing it at least in some big automotive companies, where private vehicles are now being developed only with carbon neutral technologies. And there's no more investment in research on, for example, fossil fuel engines. It's all centered on the climate neutral technologies. So businesses could be following the push from the young generations, also a positive
Thank you, Andrea. Kimberly?
I'll echo what a few of you have been saying about the young people and the drive that people seem to have to make some change. One negative thing I'd like to bring up is I really appreciated Swint's comments about the company that encourages the use of refilling water bottles and things like this. But one really discouraging thing that I think many of us have seen in this past 20 months is the cessation of using these reusable coffee cups, things like this. There's a lot more single use happening because of COVID. There's a huge amount of masks on the street and in waste areas, plastic gloves, things like this. And I think that that's a real danger point in the next few years of people continuing with those habits. You know, the requirement to have packaged lunches at events and things like that aren't necessarily helping the situation. That being said, I'm impressed with the city's ban on plastic bags. That's an important thing that's happened, and Temple's efforts to be more sustainable. There's a lot more that can be done, but as we know, things move slowly in some of these areas, and I think that there are a lot of people at Temple who are working very hard to change the way that our large Temple footprint is being felt.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. So let's turn to COP26, the Glasgow Climate Change Conference. And so everybody here, I think, has been following it on the panel to some extent or another. So just like to hear your take on the events at COP26. Where did they leave us at? Are there silver linings to what's happened at COP26? What should we be wary of the agreement coming out of it, et cetera? Marissa, you want to go first this time?
I'll just let Andrea go first. Well, for me, the methane cap that we addressed methane. And I was listening to a forum earlier today from the Harvard School of Public Health. And if we can get methane down by 30%, what the target is, I believe it, that we can buy ourselves about 10 years. Of warming, which then we can really start to amp up in that 10-year period of dealing with the carbon pollution. So I think methane was a low-hanging fruit. I mean, and also getting and keeping our eye on ExxonMobil and all these other companies that were there saying, oh yeah, we'll do our thing. We're going to cap our wells. We're going to, fix the leaky pipes. But the thing that we have now too is we have technologies. We know exactly where those emissions are coming from. So we have to keep an close eye on the emitters and hold them accountable. So I think, and also the whole agricultural is now we have this agriculture innovative mission for climate, where there's now money being put in. Now we're talking dollars. $4 billion are going to be made available, or 4 billion, 4 million. Let's say 4 million. Forgive me, but now we're starting to talk dollars and cents. And now we can have, and Penn State, shout out to Pennsylvania, got a chunk of that money to do innovation in agriculture and how to deal with pests and how to make agriculture more efficient. And that data will then go out to the world. So hopefully that with the methane cap and this, there's going to be by COP27, there's going to be even more investments being pledged. And then we're going to really start to really hold accountable in this next year. I think that's going to be key, holding accountable of those that said they're going to do what they're going to do and hold their feet to the fire and move forward. So I'll yield it to the rest of the panelists on that one. I have more to say, but I'll yield to.
Thank you, Marissa. Andrea.
Well, I'll just pick up on what Marissa was saying. We need to hold countries accountable, and to do so, we need to analyze their national determined contributions, which are the plans that countries present. Now it has been the first year after Paris, so they presented them in Paris, then 5 years later in Glasgow, and we're going to assess these plans in 5 years, and then they have to revise them for every 5 years to meet the targets that we set in Paris. Now, when we entered Glasgow, so on the 31st of October, 150 countries presented their NDCs, accounting for almost 50% of the global emissions. And the scientific community told us that if these countries were to fully implement their plans, we would still have a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees Celsius by 2100. So we're well above the threshold that the scientific community told us that we were not supposed to overcome. But then the conference started. So I want to try to see the glass not half empty, but half full. We had 120 world leaders attending the first 2 or 3 days, including the US, which was absent for the years prior to this. In Glasgow, India pledged for carbon neutrality by 2070. So they did not meet the 2050 target, but India is, together with China and the US, the most important partner in trying to reduce the carbon emissions. So by analyzing now, 2 weeks after Glasgow started, if we look at the NDCs, we are a little bit closer to our targets if we project them to 2100. So we're between 1.8 degrees Celsius and 2.4. Depends who assesses the NDCs. So the International Energy Agency is telling us 1.8, but the civil society is assessing for 2.4. Having said this, I fully agree with what Marissa said about the global methane pledge. 100 countries pledged to reduce by 30% by 2030 the emissions of methane. And methane is one of the most dangerous GHGs in terms of global warming. And then we have money. She talked about money as well. We're falling short of the target of 100 billion US dollars, and we're gonna achieve it not in 2020 because we missed it, but we're gonna probably achieve it in 2023. And that money is important to bring all developing countries in, which are yet not emitting as we are. So I'll leave it here. The glass is, if you want to be positive, still, the glass is there. We have the container. So we have the global agreement. Let's continue pouring water in it.
Thank you, Andrea. Swint.
Thank you. So we kind of, as we looked at what was happening, we tried to have agreements and move forward in the areas of forest, coal, cash for mitigation, and cars. And the one that I want to start, the negative one that I want to start out is with cars. And so we are seeing, a lot of that is driven by what happens in Japan. Japan is a player on that. And unfortunately, I do not see Japan stepping up with e-cars, and the corporate community here is therefore holding Japan as a nation, its participation and its policy is holding that back. And so that's not good news. I do think, however, that we saw, as others have suggested, world leaders there stepping up and coming to the table in a way that we haven't seen. And Andrea, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is while we did the first reports 5 years after Paris, that the reports will come more regularly now, that there will be annual reporting rather than just 5-year reporting. And I think that kind of insight on how we are moving forward on a more regular basis is a positive sign. I think that, as others have mentioned, that there have been, while the total agreement may have just may have had weak language, there have been some smaller sub-agreements, as mentioned, methane, and we're probably going to see, I think, going forward, bilateral and multilateral, even when all the nations can't come to agreement. I do think that we will see some movement by subgroups of that will be effective.
All right, well, thank you very much, Swint. All right, let's turn now to the topic of teaching and education. There are many faculty at Temple who don't normally think about their courses or perhaps even their fields as being directly related to climate change, yet recognize the ongoing problem and would like to do more to educate their students on the topic. Do you have any recommendations for how they could get started or what they could do? And I'd like to start with Kimberly on this.
As you just presented this again, I started thinking about it more because of the added part that you added about how they could get started. Maybe you alluded to outside resources, or maybe that's where my brain went. I remember I was on a panel that you led a few years ago where this came up quite a lot, and it seemed like many of the faculty who were in that workshop were sort of self-selected. They were people who often would already be teaching about climate change somehow in their discipline. But there were a couple of people who were not, and we discussed more broadly how to bring this into the classroom. And because there are some disciplines where people feel that they are not relevant. So I think I would encourage people to think a little more broadly. So for example, the way I introduce myself, and I'm an archaeologist. So I don't study modern climate change. I don't study modern policy. I don't study modern businesses or modern nutrition like the rest of this panel. I study the past, and I use what I know from my study of the past to try to initiate a conversation with students and get them to look outside of what I'm teaching to make connections with other classes. So I think that for those who don't know where to start, that's where you start. Why are you interested in climate change? Share that with your students. Share what part it seems maybe tangentially relevant, but which actually is relevant. We're all affected by this. And everybody's future profession, everybody's future research, future, all of our lives will be affected by climate change. And so I think that we can draw it into most classrooms. Statistics class, I teach statistics, in anthropology. I bring that in all the time. I bring in newspaper articles, magazine articles, talking about climate change as an example of how to understand statistical analysis, presentation of data, that kind of thing. That's subtle. You're showing them a newspaper article that's presenting a bar chart or a graph that's maybe misrepresenting or misinterpreting data about changes that are happening. And that is one way, even if you're not teaching specifically how to change this, you can be teaching, you can be educating, you can be increasing environmental literacy with any topic, most likely.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. Marissa.
Oh, yes, echo. And to add to that is just get your students involved, just ask them. And even ask yourself, what brought you to your profession? What brought you to the classes that you teach? Grab onto that, hold on to that, and then think about your passion as we go forward in the unpredictable future. And where do you see your place? So ask your students as we move forward in the unpredictableness that's ahead of us. How does this relate to you? Can we push this forward into the future that is the unknown? Let me tell you, the students, they'll tell you, because they've been thinking about this. They've been thinking about their futures, and having them can make their own connections. I think it's very powerful for both people, for both sides of that classroom, to hear that.
Thank you, Marissa. Swint.
Thank you. I think that I want to talk to one of my perspectives is students in the business school. And so, as I've mentioned several times here, businesses will have an important role to play going forward. And businesses want to attract the best employees. And so demand that your companies don't greenwash. Someone mentioned in the chat, how do we get companies to not engage in greenwashing? One of the ways is to stand up when you of what your own company is doing. I think I just saw a chat, someone saying that individual action is not enough. And I absolutely agree with that. But I also think that we cannot abdicate our own individual responsibilities to hold our companies and our governments responsible. One of the things that we did here is we had a panel on careers and sustainability. And we had people from various companies talking about how they came to raise their hand to lead their efforts there. I thought one of the most impressive was a woman from LVMH, Louis Vuitton, who said that she had no background in sustainability, and yet she felt that it was important for her to raise her hand. And so, as we talk to our students, we need to encourage them to, from wherever they are, to make that statement of impact in their organizations, in their investments, and in their careers. Thank you.
Thank you, Swint. Andrea?
I agree with what most has been said on this topic. I think students are the most informed on climate change. As I said before, it's a topic that they feel on their skin, but they're also very exposed to consumerism and to consumer culture. So in my experience, very brief, I've been teaching since 2017, I feel with anxiety within students when I talk about climate change. So I have to like even mellow it down in my course and try to always associate a problem with a potential solution. So I think it's also up to us to, as teachers, to provide them with knowledge, with the information and confidence that they need to take their decisions, but also to try to help them manage this internal anxiety that I feel that most students have on this topic. And it's not easy. It's entering your personal values. So you can work with knowledge a lot, but you also have to listen a lot. And that does not only touch on my course, it's on sustainable environments, but as Kimberly said, it can go across all courses. I mean, it's something that we speak about, we talk about in our daily lives, just like we're talking about pandemics now, and we were talking about that up until 18 months ago. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And that concludes the main portion of our program. I'd like to thank all the panelists for all the thoughts they'd share and invite people, if they're so inclined, to use the reaction tool, to perhaps use the clap or thumbs up icon, or to signal visually. We're now going to turn to Q&A. So if you have a question for the panel in general or one of the specific panelists, I would invite you to either put it in the chat or use the raise hand icon under the reaction tools, and I will call on you and invite you to unmute your mic. Either way is fine. I see a hand up. Is that Deja? Please go ahead.
Yes, so my question pertains to the conversation earlier around agriculture. And my question is, with food waste playing a substantial role in methane gases, how can we start conversations around more functional composting centers and the idea of not just taking resources out of the soil, but putting them back in? Companies coming out with compostable items is not enough when most individuals don't have access to proper composting centers. So it's essentially still contributing to the problem of waste.
Oh, thank you for that great question. I'm going to throw that to Marissa.
Yeah, waste is huge in this country. And it was interesting to watch the panel yesterday. I hope you had a chance to check that out, from students from all around our different Temple campuses around the world, where waste, there is compost everywhere. Compost bins are everywhere, which that was in Rome, actually. So yeah, we need to change the culture. We need to have compost bins everywhere. So how do we do that? Well, again, students, we got to make it known. We have to educate the powers that be that this is what's needed. This is what's wanted. We definitely, in this country, that we don't see in Europe, is that, we go and we buy in bulk, where in other countries it's more you buy as you go. You get what you need for that particular day or that couple days. We're not this buying for the whole month kind of thing, and then half of that's going to go to waste. So our whole culture here in the United States definitely needs to change, and we need to look to our neighbors to see how they've been doing it, right? And I think this whole this whole climate change reiterates that we need to learn from each other. There's no other better generation out there to make this happen, who is more tuned in to the global neighbors as your generation, the Generation Z. So make your demands known that this needs to change, and what we're seeing, you're being listened to. Change will come.
Thank you, Marissa. Amelia, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry, computer was lagging a little bit.
It's okay.
Yeah, so somewhat of a question, I guess, but also kind of more so just to bring up the topic. Well, I just want to start off by saying that I am a student at Temple Ambler, and I study horticulture, and I'm also a student gardener there. And we recently, back in September, we were hit by a tornado during Hurricane Ida, which decimated pretty much our entire collection of woody tree specimens and our old growth forest. So right now we're looking at just how to rebuild and how to do that with climate change in mind and more sustainable ecological practices in mind as well. But that being said, I did want to just kind of piggyback off of the agriculture topic. So I was wondering, Marissa, if you have looked into the how increasing levels of carbon are impacting nutrient levels in food crops, because I've recently been looking into a lot of studies surrounding that and some of the reasoning behind it. And I think that's a topic that doesn't get that much coverage, but it's really important because it might have even larger of an impact than a reduction in the yield of food crops.
Yeah, the research, more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the plants are getting bigger, but they're getting less nutrient dense. And that is a huge issue for those that already are facing malnutrition on a mass level in their populations. I'm thinking like rice. So yeah, that carbon fertilizes, but almost too quickly where the nutrient composition of these plants can't catch up. So yeah, that is a huge, another face of climate change that needs to be brought to the forefront. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, I just want to say in terms of that, I think that pushing the need for more sustainable agriculture practices, whether it's alternating crops and not having just monocultures where you're only growing one type of crop in a field and consistently doing that, building up the soil ecology to make sure that there are nutrients there, and also looking at more of like plant physiology and what is specifically going on there, because I think that plants can teach us so much about how to move forward in the situation. And I think that from what I've gleaned from the research that I was looking into, it seems like part of the problem is that plants, due to the excess carbon that they're experiencing and that growth in photosynthesis, they're actually experiencing a little bit less stress during that. And that might be part of why they're not accumulating so many nutrients because the stress responses aren't triggering them. So yeah, just really kind of emphasizing that we need to include science in this and not just profit.
Exactly. Yeah. Look at the science. Let the natural world teach us on how we're going to get through this. There's lots of lessons to be learned from a plant and ecology, definitely. So if anyone wants to add to that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your great questions and comments, Amelia. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Oh, Deja, go ahead.
So I'm a sophomore currently. I'm looking for internships for next summer, but also just thinking like about my future in general. What do you guys think because I am in the Fox School of Business. My major is supply chain management. What roles do you think I can play in businesses that have a focus in sustainability?
Swint, could you speak to that perhaps?
So two things. One, the overall, as I mentioned before, we are in a period where we have to rethink our supply chains. And so to rethink, because we realize that we can no longer be on such an edge and the lack of supplies that we're having here. So as you go into supply chain management, in general, that's going to be the most critical area strategically for all companies in issues of climate change, but also in issues unrelated to climate change, to the extent that there is anything unrelated to climate change. The second thing that I would say is we are looking at supply chains in terms of social, environmental, and that capacity or that new perspective of where we get our products from and who made those products, I think is also the important thing for supply chains to look at going forward. And finally, I would say that, so I guess the question for you now mostly, as a sophomore, as a soon to graduate, is what kind of skills will you need to make the most impact at the early part of your career? And I think that that will have to do with measurement. I think that when we think about what companies lack and what companies will need to do better is to measure impact. And so as you look for internships and try to define what skills you have as a soon to graduate student, I would focus on that.
Can I add to this? Wait.
Sure.
LCA is your life cycle assessment. LCA, if you don't know those tools yet, definitely get to know them. And there's impacts, there's carbon, you can come up with carbon footprints, water footprints, ecological footprints, which is the impact on planet Earth, based on supply chain. So if you can follow LCA maps out from seed to plate in terms of nutrition, and you can actually see impacts along the whole chain. So LCA you want to get familiar with. And if there's any, so engineers use this, so, but tap into the engineers and bring it into your field.
Thank you so much.
Email me if you want me to, just email me and I can set you up and where to go with that.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to reach out. Thank you guys so much.
That's a great field to go into too, by the way.
Yeah, I'm excited. My main focus is kind of trying to convince people not to overconsume and just the idea of recycling what we already have. Like the idea that we have like 50 ships just sitting outside of like California filled with stuff ready to just be unloaded when we already have department stores filled to the brim currently with stuff is mind-blowing, and it's really bothering. And I think the problem with some of my peers, not the problem, but just the idea of having to constantly consume to stay on trends when trends are just, they're just trends. It's like, it's bothering. I can't get into certain conversations because people really just don't care. But I'm like, we all have an impact. I mean, businesses can do more, but we as individuals can do more too.
This actually connects to my thoughts on what instructors who are not in fields that they feel are climate change adjacent can do. Culturally, we tend to respond to the now and the next, and teaching courses that encourage long-term historical thinking, projecting into the future and taking bigger picture views will help people of every field be able to better understand the challenges we're facing.
Yes.
So, Amelia, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention something about that business aspect of things, because that just stimulated an interesting thought. So because so much of business and just, in capitalism is about competition, I wonder if taking an approach where businesses hold other businesses kind of accountable, kind of call them out on that, and the lack of their practices, if that could perhaps have some kind of benefit, so that it's like if a business lowers their prices, then the other business feels compelled to do the same to compete. So maybe doing that, but more so through climate change and sustainable initiatives. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think the biggest punch that the climate activists can do, especially you Gen Z, is protesting the companies are doing good and holding up, make it aware of the companies that are not doing good. And if we can get into some sort of food labeling too, or some sort of labeling on these, doing carbon footprints and water footprints on actual labeling and actually see, I don't know, on different tangents here, but if you can buy certain products and keep feeding, tell the companies are doing it right. Yes, 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 keep with that. The other companies will jump on board just by default because they want to stay competitive. Excuse me, I'm not a business, but that's my take on it. But also, Gen Z, if you can really start to track the money and the flow of money and those that finance the continuation of a status quo. I think that's where that's where we're going to really hit it where it counts, so to speak, in terms of creating change.
I think that's a good, I will say I'm not Gen Z, but I do think it's a good point, but I do worry a little bit, that's okay. I do worry that there's a little bit of an overemphasis on what these like millennials, Gen Z, all that, what we can do. I think that we can do a lot, but at the same time, to be quite honest, I just don't think that there's enough time to do some of these moves and see enough progress happening. And I think it has to be more on like a political, like government level. So maybe that means these generations going into politics, going into local government, things along those lines where actual the policies are being made that influence these things the most. But I do agree with you that being very careful about who we give our money to is an important thing, but I don't know. I think convenience sometimes overrides things.
Yeah, if I could just mention something there, I think that there are a couple of drivers that businesses listen to. As we've already mentioned, consumers, and as I alluded to before, trying to draw the best employees. And so businesses will want to have will want to have a good reputation, and they're going to, in some cases, manipulate what they actually do in order to look good. But I think the bottom line for businesses is the cost of capital. I've seen some notes in the chat about tax incentives, but I think a bigger impact or another impact on companies is how much does their capital cost. And if we can move to a way where it's more expensive for them to get money, to borrow money, when we talk about the financing of coal, all of these things have a tremendous impact on the behaviors of businesses. And this is one way that we can begin to tackle some of these issues.
Thank you, Swinton. Well, I see that we are about out of time, so I'd like to once again thank all of our panelists. I'd like to thank Suzanne and Evan for organizing this event. And we would invite everybody still in the room to please put in the chat one thing that you've learned or one thing that you're taking away from this event. And as you can see here, we have some advertisement for the other events for our International Education Week. So thank you everybody who attended today for joining us. And Suzanne, any final thoughts or words?
I would just reiterate, I want to really thank the panelists for being here today, especially those of you who are here very, very late and very, very early in the morning. We really appreciate you helping to bring together perspectives from all of our campuses. And it was really wonderful to see so many people joining this conversation today and to see the passion of the younger generation. And it gives me hope too. So thank you. And thank you to Jeff for moderating, doing a wonderful job moderating today. I appreciate you.
Okay, Kayla, you have something to share? Go ahead.
Hi, yes, I was just looking at the slide and I didn't realize that I missed one of the panels that sounds interesting to me about the study abroad and sustainable living. I was just wondering if that session was recorded and if I could access it.
It was, and it's linked to our website. I can drop it in the chat for you. It looks like there's a hand up, Jeff.
There's another one up. Okay, I missed it. Oh no, that was Kayla. She put her hand back
okay.
up.
Okay.
We're good. All right. So unless anybody else has an additional comment or question, I think we're done. Have a great rest of your evening, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, everyone.